Page 202 of The Unfolding is the story of Joshua Broome.
I'm not only this person that did bad things, I'm a carrier of the scarlet letter because my worst mistakes, they're one click of a button away from anyone finding out about. So I was certain that I was unwanted and I was bad.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Another page in The Unfolding.
Hi, this is Meredith Foster. Hey, a word of caution about today's episode. If you're listening with children around, you may want to wait and listen to this one at another time. This episode includes discussion of pornography, the adult film industry, and suicide. Well, for as long as he could remember, Joshua Broome had wrestled with a feeling of emptiness. His quest for affirmation led him to excel in school and sports, and eventually in modeling and acting. Every achievement was an attempt to fill the void. When a representative of the adult film industry offered him a chance for fame and wealth, he took it. But even after appearing in more than 1,000 adult films and earning over $1 million, he was still profoundly sad and depressed, and now he felt shame over the things that he'd done, and he began contemplating suicide. Joshua's journey from darkness to light began unexpectedly in a bank, where a simple act of kindness from a teller reminded him of his true identity.
My upbringing, it wasn't chaotic, but I was in a really busy house. So my mom was 15 when she got pregnant with me, 16 when she had me. And we were living at her mom and dad's. So her mom and dad, my grandparents, and then her sister and two brothers. So a busy house. And my grandma and my grandpa loved Jesus. My grandma was kind of the catalyst for, we're going to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday, so forth, vacation Bible school, all that good stuff. But my mom got married when I was 7. So that cadence, that rhythm in my life, it was completely interrupted and it was never really restored until, far later in life. So the foundation of faith that I had, it's pretty vague to me. Like I don't really remember a ton of it. The thing that I remember most is my grandma always listening to these guys with mullets singing gospel music on the TV. Yeah, but it's like that and Andy Griffith it was always on TV.
When your mom married, was that to your dad or that was a different relationship?
Yeah, it's a different relationship. So my mom and dad, I can't even remember ever seeing them have a conversation. He was never in my life in any way, even though he was in the small town that I grew up in. I think that he tried to visit me a few times and it was either awkward or inconvenient, or I'm not sure exactly why that didn't work out the way I wish it would have, but it just didn't. Me now at 41 and a dad of 4 and just understanding a lot of life, I have a lot of empathy for that 16-year-old version of him, of how shame compounds over time and how he probably wanted to do the right thing and felt compelled to do the right thing. And once you don't do the right thing right away, it becomes easier to not do the right thing because it's hard.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that he felt a level of shame with that and just the complexity of, pretty soon after that, at 18, 19, he gets married, has this other family, ends up having 2 other kids and has this whole life that is separate from me, but in the same towns. So the person that my mom married, again, I think he found faith recently in the last few years, but this period of his life, he was not a kind man, was angry, alcoholic, abused drugs, abused my mom physically and mentally. Not a good season. So that was about a 4-year gap. So no father figure, no faith foundation. And as Romans 12:2 talks about in a very real way, because my mom was working in the restaurant industry, which anyone that's familiar with the restaurant industry, that those hours don't align with the normality of, a 9 to 5. So a lot of times my mom was doing the best that she could. And the world was conforming how I was educated in a lot of ways. And I wasn't educated in intimacy, the things of God and things like that. But what I was educated in was what the world was teaching me.
What did you think you wanted to do? Did you have an idea, as a young person or even as a teenager, like what you wanted your life to be like?
Yeah. So I would say I was very creative, but I would use things that I was good at to try to get affirmation. So from early on in my life, I felt confused and then eventually frustrated about my dad. And I thought, well, if I become enough and if I earn enough and if I achieve enough, I will maybe then feel like I am enough. And I was trying to earn enough applause to quiet the desire to hear I'm proud of you, and became the best student, became a great athlete. I started modeling and acting when I was 13 and had a lot of success, more so in modeling than acting. But even though acting was more of a passion than modeling, just had more success in that sphere. But that became my new dopamine hit of choice, where I would get booked for a job or asked to do a commercial or whatever it might be. And, I felt chosen. Mm-hmm. It was such a complicated season in my mind. I can remember this so clearly. And it's so interesting to remember this in this way. And I've dug pretty deep. I went through a lot of counseling on when I came out of the industry. When I was a high school student and, pretty decent basketball player, I was playing really well in this period of my life, thinking about the game being on the line or us needing to run a play or score some points so we could seal the victory. I cared more that the coach wanted me to take the shot than me making the shot. I cared more that he trusted me than if I did the right thing. If I won the game or made the shot, it meant more to me that he chose me, because in my heart of hearts, I felt rejected.
I think many of us do that in some way, shape, or form. We're trying to earn that affirmation. We don't even realize it.
Sure. I mean, I think you look at anything that you struggle with, any kind of habitual sin or any behavior, any proclivity towards anything that we would agree that, okay, this is not me becoming more like Jesus. I think instead of trying to say, hey, how can we modify our behavior? How can we stop doing the thing that we want to do? How do we wrestle with what Paul is talking about in Romans 7? Why do I do the things that I don't want to do and struggle to do the things I want, I ought to do? With every behavior, there's a root, and that root is more complex and often very different than the behavior. I would say most people who struggle with pornography, it wasn't born out of this over sexualized appetite that is, we call lust. It was probably born out of loneliness or brokenness or hurt or rejection, and you tried to mitigate the wound that you had in your heart with something where you wouldn't be rejected or you would feel chosen in some way because you could control more variables. And you felt like even though you would know that this is fictitious in a way or a counterfeit version of the intimacy that you desire, something about that, it filled the gap even for a moment, or maybe even suppressed the things that you don't want to deal with. Then all of a sudden you become addicted to not feeling the feeling that you are feeling, or you become addicted to suppressing the conversation or the thing that you don't want to think or talk about. And all of a sudden, yes, there's a lot of neuroscience around the habitual nature of consuming pornography, but it's so much more deeper than people realize. And that's why it's growing and in such an astronomical level, because I think when you try to scale a solution for a problem that has this individual nuance to it, you can't fix people's hearts with a program or an app. It's more complicated than that. There's most certainly great content and apps and resources that will set you on this journey towards healing, but it's going to start with a one-on-one conversation to say, hey, why did you say yes the first time? And why do you continue to say yes when you know it's not best for you?
You would say your adolescent years were kind of setting up that pattern of chasing after the dopamine hit of approval, of affirmation. What were relationships like? I mean, I assume you're a popular guy, you're good on the basketball team and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's because I felt inadequate. I lived as if no one could love me. And I think what was more true is I didn't allow anyone to love me. I didn't believe that I had anything of value to offer. So I would, I call it a first date mask, where I didn't think I had anything to offer. So which each and every relationship, friends or girlfriends or whatever it might be, I would try to become who I thought they wanted me to be, because I thought if I would become something else or become someone else and I had these characteristics that looked attractive to this person, then they would like me, because if they truly know who I was, then they wouldn't want anything to do with me. But so because of that, all of my friendships and all of my, girlfriend, boyfriend relationships, they were very surface level. So they were numerous in quantity, but shallow in depth. And I think it was because I did lack integrity to an extent, but I think more so, I really didn't think I had too much to offer. So I tried my best to keep everyone at arm distance, because I thought, well, it's inevitable that they're either A, going to hurt me, or they're going to leave me when they find out who I truly am.
Wow, that's a really wearisome way to live. This is a total rabbit trail, but have you ever seen the movie Runaway Bride?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my wife, like if there's a movie that has Julia Roberts or Jennifer Lopez in it.
You've seen it?
I've seen it. I may have fallen asleep at some point, but I've certainly watched at least the first 15 minutes.
When you begin to recognize that quality in yourself, that you have morphed yourself to fit whatever you think that person wants or is interested in, that's the runaway bride syndrome. So, you're just describing something that many of us have done. Sometimes we grow out of it and sometimes we don't. We're stunted in that, and it takes something bigger.
Yeah. I think that I'm able to offer people assistance in, figuring things out and help people in some ways today, because what I've developed for myself is a heightened level of self-awareness. You need to develop self-awareness before you can develop obedience and discipline, because if you don't see the thing in which you're tripping over, you're going to continue to trip over it, even if you don't want to. Yeah, to your point, it's like, just being able to see outside of yourself to say, why am I doing some of the things I'm doing, was so helpful for me.
So high school, chasing affirmation, I think that's really interesting that you're modeling and doing commercials even as a teenager. That's such an unusual thing, which I would think would be very affirming, right? Not many people get to do that, or at least not where I grew up.
Yeah. And it was almost like it created a gap in my friend group in high school, just because people drove tractors and lawnmowers to school. I mean, you're like a country town.
Wait, where did you grow up?
Pageland, South Carolina.
Okay.
Yeah, so I graduated with less than 100 people. But yeah, so super small town. And, I was modeling, doing all this stuff. But, I didn't really think too much about it. Nothing was a big deal to me. And it was almost like I was just wandering through life. Continued doing that. So went to college in South Carolina. So went to Francis Marion University, studied theater, started having more success in acting and modeling. And I had a conversation online with an agent in Hollywood. And ultimately she said it would be advantageous for me to move to a place in which that industry was thriving. And she agreed to represent me if I moved there. And I was like, okay, it makes sense. So I dropped out of college the second semester of my sophomore year and moved there, and kind of picked up where, I was in my life. I was having more success modeling than I was acting, did several campaigns, Fashion Week, stuff like that. And acting was like pretty sporadic. It wasn't like something that I wasn't always going on auditions. And then modeling, it got to the point where I had had enough success where I didn't have to fight so hard to get jobs. My agent was like, hey, you're being considered for this. And then I would either get it or I didn't. Acting was more of a grind. It was a very different process than modeling. I'd been there for a few years, and then at 22, I'm in the middle of West Hollywood, and then these three girls who were headhunters for the porn industry, they approached me and they were like, hey, have you ever considered acting? And I was like, oh, great. This is an opportunity for me.
Here's my break.
Yeah. And that's what I thought initially. They're, no, we're talking about pornography. And I think it's really important because, we started talking about my childhood. I seen porn for the first time when I was 13 years old. My cousin showed me a magazine that was pornographic. It was so important for people to have these conversations with their children because I did not have any example or instruction when it came to what did intimacy look like between a man and a woman. Like all I'd seen for the most part was this man that I barely knew abuse my mom. Like that's the only thing that I had seen. Then all of a sudden I saw this photographic, depiction of what I thought might be love. I was wrestling with, am I worthy of love? And maybe if I experience something that is on these pages with someone, maybe that is love and I will feel loved if I do that. And I never really struggled with consuming that content in that way, but it was most certainly a catalyst for me pursuing women in that way. And I was very promiscuous in high school and college. So these three girls asking me, do I want to be a part of the industry? Do I want to be in the pages of this magazine that I saw 9 years earlier? And I was living my life not that different from what they were inviting me into. I knew I should have said no, and I knew it would be detrimental to what I was pursuing, but I almost had this ignorance of, well, how big of a deal could it be? And it wasn't because I felt invincible. If I'm honest, I really lived my life like nothing mattered. I certainly didn't count the cost before I made decisions. I said, sure, I'll meet with their agent. And this agent asked me 3 questions when I met with him. He asked me, how did I grow up? What was I doing in LA? And what did I hope to accomplish? In retrospect, how did you grow up? Pretty strange question for someone to ask when you're first meeting them. But if someone wanted to manipulate you, it's a perfect question to ask.
Oh.
So I answer him. I grew up pretty much just me and my mom. He hears, great. He comes from a broken home. And then I say, well, I'm in LA trying to be in this creative space, modeling, acting. I enjoy, photography, videography. And he's like, well, what do you hope to accomplish? And I said, I want to be famous. And famous is not something that you can truly achieve. It's not a goal to have because there's no tangible metric that's attached to it. Even if you set a metric and you reach it, 99.9% of the time when you achieve the thing that you thought would satisfy you, it's not going to work. And you're just going to believe this lie well, if I had a little bit more, maybe then I would feel satisfied. But when I said I wanted to be famous, maybe in my subconscious, but my broken heart was saying, I want to be known. I want to be loved. I want to be seen. I want to feel like I'm enough. And I thought if I do enough, I would feel like enough. That conversation led me to doing a film, and that film destroyed everything that I was doing. My mainstream representation found out, and they were like, hey, we can't be associated with this. This is 2006, very different world. They were appalled that I had done that. And I had this relationship with my agent, and it was almost like, she was a family member. And she was just like, hey, I think you've got so much potential and I care about you as a person, but we can't be associated with you since your likeness is now tied to this. I'm so sorry. I really wish you the best, but we can't represent you anymore.
For a guy who was so after affirmation, how did that land on you to have that? I assume it came with shame.
Oh, certainly. Well, so in the same day that happened, and then, if anyone that's from a small town can resonate with this, it's it only takes one person to know one thing about your life for everyone to know everything about your life. So very quickly, word got back to my mom, and she called me. And, growing up in a small town, it's how much of your name that your mama uses is how much you're in trouble. So she used my whole name. And I knew that she had found out something that I had done and I was in trouble. She was hurt and disappointed. And she asked me if I had done that. And I said yes. And there was this silence. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if an apology was even the right thing to say. I was just speechless because I had hurt the only person that never hurt me. my identity up until that point was I am my mother's son. Like that was the thing that I was most proud of. There was something that broke in me when she was abused and I saw it and I couldn't save her. I felt like, man, I can't even get this right. And it made me think, well, no wonder my dad doesn't want me. But I still like clung to that. And then I was like, man, it's like, of course you blew it. Of course you hurt her. Of course you did the wrong thing. It's not something you did. It's who you are. And that's the way shame works. So then like that happens. And then I'm like, well, I might as well just go all in. And I thought, okay, well, I might as well continue doing what I did because this is who I am now. And right on time, the agent, the porn agent calls me and he's like, hey, I would love to sign you to a contract. And I agreed. And I stayed in that industry for 6 years and he helped me in a way get everything that he promised me. I made millions of dollars, did over 1,000 movies, did all the stuff, won all the awards. And it was almost like, man, I felt like I knew that the acting I was doing, like it was satire in a way. Like it was, even though I would like give it my all and I would just try to pretend like I was doing something that was worthwhile or something that I could be proud of or something along those lines, but I knew what was true. I do all the things that I set out to do. And when I had everything that I thought I would have that would bring me satisfaction and make me feel like I was somebody, when it didn't work, especially when I won Performer of the Year, like that's like the top award that you can win in that industry. When I won that award in 2012, I thought that it would make me feel validated in a way that would subside the pretty intense anxiety and depression I was wrestling with, because there's something very real that comes with suppressing reality. It's like you're going by a pseudonym. Just doing that led me to just really be struggling with my mental health. And then I won that award. And when it didn't make me feel like I thought it would, I was like, okay, I've blew it. And I have everything that I thought would make me feel better about myself. And now that I don't, I might as well die. And made a very clear plan to take my life.
You mentioned pseudonyms, so you literally were using a different name. I assume also you're probably only surrounded with people who support or benefit from what you're doing. So there's no other voice coming in to be helpful.
Yeah, so literally, because the way accountability works is if you love someone, you call them out and you call them up. It's like, hey, you're living differently than the person I know you to be. You're better than that. So the people that don't agree with what you're doing and challenge you, you've got two options. You either listen to them and change, or you push them away. And I pushed everyone away. Mm-hmm. So I literally had ostracized myself to the point where I hadn't even heard my name for over a year.
Your birth name?
My actual name.
Wow.
And that kind of, sets the stage for the day that I planned to take my life. So I made a very clear plan and I set up everything I needed. And the last thing that I was going to do before I did that was deposit this check, because I just got back from doing a film and I thought like, okay, I needed someone to give me permission to do the thing that I wanted to do. So I went into a bank, and on the memo of that check, it was clear what I was being compensated for. And I slid the check across the counter, and I was waiting for this person to look at me and shake her head in disgust or say something under her breath or even to my face. And instead, she didn't really miss a beat. And then after she deposited the check, I became increasingly more anxious. And she handed me the receipt and I went to walk away. She kind of stopped me and she said, hey, Joshua, are you okay? Joshua, how can I help you? Her doing that saved my life. Because what I did instead was I ran home with tears in my eyes and I called my mom.
Why would a stranger calling Joshua by name change his life? God was just beginning to teach him about his true identity. How long had it been since you talked to your mom?
Almost a year.
Wow.
And it wasn't because she stopped calling. I thought I was doing her a favor because what kind of son am I? She said everything that I didn't think she would. She said, after she chewed me out a little bit, after she, because she wanted to know if I was okay. And I robbed her from that. Mm. There were literally people dying. Roommates that I had were dying. There were people who I was on set with dying of HIV. There was people, suicide and overdose left and right. 250 people in the last 30 years have died of either murder, suicide, or overdose.
Wow.
33 people that I know personally like that I was close with, friends with, have died of either suicide or overdose
Oh, my goodness.
since I've been out of the industry. I've been out of the industry for 11 years.
What do you think it was about the teller? Was it that she said your name?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think about like you go by a pseudonym because you're trying to cover the shame that comes with doing the thing that you're ashamed of. The manipulation, the coercion in the industry, it's very intentional and very thought out and very methodical. It's not a coincidence. What it caused me to do is I essentially created a plausible reality based on, guilt and shame, and I become numb to everything. I developed this apathy for everything, and I was completely disconnected and indifferent. When she said my name, it made me feel something, and I felt something for the first time. And the first thing that popped in my mind was that, man, I was robbing my mom of simply knowing that I was okay. Ran home and called her, and she said, I love you, and you're so much better than this. We will figure this out. You can do something else. You're so smart and so capable. I love you so much. Please come home. So I did. So I quit that day.
Wow.
It's so interesting. So I quit that day, but I brought the wounds mentally and emotionally of living that way. Instead of healing, I tried to pretend like it never happened. So I start working in the health and fitness space, get a great mentor, get a bunch of accreditations, get education, and I tried to put enough good dirt on my bad dirt so I didn't feel dirty. I truly thought me changing is not possible, but what I can do is maybe I can manage people's perception of me, and if I am perceived to be good in this aspect, maybe that would supersede the bad that I've done in my life. And I did that for 2 years. So that went on for 2 years regarding my mental health again. Like I started to like really struggle with that and started contemplating suicide and things like that. And because I was like, well, even though I'm doing good things and I truly love helping people, there's a lid on how deep I can go with people, because once someone knows who I am, either that relationship would end or there would be like a wall that would put up. And often I was the one doing that.
You are presuming their judgment or presuming their shame on you.
Yeah, it's like I've got to disconnect before they leave me. And then that goes on for about 2 years. And then I met this girl and we go on this walk, and I'm just like, man, it's almost like I had my mom's voice in the back of my head saying, don't you lie to that girl. Don't you hurt that girl.
Oh.
And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to tell her who I am, and I'm going to save us both the pain of finding out my past. This was Easter 9 years ago when we met to go on a run that ended up being a walk. And on that walk, I pretty much right away, I was like, hey, I got something that I want to tell you. And it was almost like ripping off this Band-Aid, of like, I hadn't been forthcoming with this information to anyone ever. And I'm just like, hey, and then it's just like 5-minute monologue of like, hey, this is how bad I am. This is who I am. This is all the bad things that I've done that I can remember. And this is who I am. And she pretty quickly asked, like, okay, like, are you doing these things now? Is this like things that you are actively participating in? I was like, no, I've been out of that industry. So this was Easter 2015. And I had left the industry in January of 2013. I was like, no, I'm not doing any of that stuff now. I've been out of that, industry for 2 years. And then she just like looked at me and looked down and looked around, and we walked and didn't say anything. And I was like itching in the silence, just like, what is she going to say? Why didn't she just like right away tell me to like, get out of there, or, she wanted to leave or whatever. And then she stopped and she got really serious, and she looked at me and said, I want you to know a person's not defined by the worst thing they've ever done. And a person's not defined by the greatest thing they'll ever do. There's a God that exists outside of time, space, and matter, and he created absolutely everything, including me and you. And because you are not God, you don't get to define yourself. And while the things that you did are real and the trauma that that those things caused and the feelings associated with them, those things are all real and true, but that doesn't define who you are because you don't get to do that. Like, do you know who God is? Until she asked me that question, if I'm honest, I had enough information where, like, sure, I believe that the universe and the people in it, there had to be a first cause. So, like, yeah, like I believe that God created everything. Sure. Jesus seems awesome from what I know. So sure, yes. And then she was like, she moved from acknowledgement to relationship. She was like, well, I have been following Jesus for a long time, since I was in 7th grade. In my whole family, our relationship with Jesus is very important. And I'm not perfect by any means, but my relationship with him is the foundation that I live my life on and live my life through. So what kind of food do you like? I was like, what? Like, who are you? Like, do you like tacos or?
Oh
like,
my goodness. So when she says, she brings up food, what in the world did you make of that?
I was like, man. Well, I mean, if I'm honest, she confronted everything that was most true about me. I was like, who I am is I'm this unwanted child that their dad didn't want. And, I'm not only this person that did bad things, I'm a carrier of the scarlet letter because my worst mistakes, the things that I would never want anyone to find out about, they're one click of a button away from anyone finding out about. So I was certain that I was unwanted and I was bad. I was certain of that. And she challenged that, but she challenged it in a way that it makes me think like Colossians 4:6. It's her speech was seasoned with salt and gracious, and she knew how she ought to answer me. And it was, because of the way that she responded to me with both truth and grace, it cultivated this curiosity. To be honest, she is absolutely gorgeous also. So that was a factor, in the intrigue. She presented this like, well, this is just true and you need to know it. You're wrong. You're wrong. And you need to know what is true. So we walked and talked, and then we text like, high schoolers all week long, just kind of getting to know each other. And she invited me to church that next week. And I went to church, if I'm honest, just wanted to be wherever she was. I walk in this church and I heard the gospel, and it absolutely wrecked me. It was out of this, I think this is important. I don't want to nerd out too hard, but the sermon was about 2 Samuel chapter 9. And like in this story, you got David, Ziba, and Mephibosheth. David was now in the pinnacle of his reign as king, and Jonathan and David were these like good buddies. And Saul was Jonathan's dad. So God had stripped the kingdom away from Saul because he had sinned. And then David was chosen and anointed to be king. And then, along the way, Saul went crazy and he was trying to kill David. And Jonathan was his best friend. So Jonathan, being Saul's son, Jonathan would say, hey, David, if my dad is like trying to pull one over on you, trying to, sneak up on you or plot against you, I'm going to let you know. And then in 1 Samuel, there's this covenantal promise that David says, hey, I'm going to promise to show you kindness, not only you, but your family forever. And then now fast forward. So Saul and Jonathan had died in battle. Mephibosheth, at 5 years old, these nurses pick him up and go running with him to hide him. And it's because historically, when there were opposing families that had access to the kingdom, whoever was, currently king would say, hey, let's identify anyone that might be outliers, that might try to lead an uprising and have them eradicated, have them killed. So that had been done throughout history. So the nurse was running with Mephibosheth because he was next to be king. So he thought, okay, it makes sense that he's going to die. And, this part of the story, Mephibosheth is now like in this place called Lodabar, and it's this like desert wasteland in this part of Palestine. And he's hiding because he thought, if I'm found, I'm going to be killed. And David sends this guard to go find him because he starts to remember this covenantal promise to Jonathan. And now he's like, okay, I want to do something good for God's people. And he's like, oh yeah, I made this promise to Jonathan. And he summons this guard, Ziba. And Ziba used to serve King Saul. And he was like, hey, is there anyone left out of the family of Saul? And he's like, yeah, Mephibosheth he's in hiding. And I actually know where he is. And he goes and gets Mephibosheth and brings him before David. And now we got this moment where Mephibosheth is standing before David thinking like, okay, this is doomsday. I'm found. My head's on the chopping block. And instead, David offers him grace. He says, hey, I'm going to restore your grandfather's land to you. I'm going to invite you into this kingdom, to be part of this kingdom. And the land wasn't just any land. It was part of Canaan, so it was part of the promised land. So in a way, he was adopting him into his family. And he said that he wanted him to have a seat at his table, not for that evening, but forever. This is grace, a beautiful picture of grace. But what's so interesting was 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 8, Mephibosheth's response was, that's great and all, but don't you know who I am? He refers to himself as a dead dog. And in the same way, I had heard Romans 3:23 that, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And then Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So, we're all guilty and we're all deserving of death, this eternal separation from God. So what are we to do? And then, okay, I hear the gospel that Jesus, being fully man, fully God, coming to this world, born of a virgin, lives a perfect life, dies on the cross for me, and then raises on the third day. And if you put your faith in him, you're saved. And it's like, that's amazing for whoever that's for, but don't you know who I am? And then I hear him read. Man, every time I say this, it's like, it's hard to get emotional because I heard the pastor read Hebrews 12:2, and he was talking about how it was with joy set before him that Jesus endured the cross, scorning our shame. And what I heard in my heart and what invaded my heart in that moment was that I understood that, yes, Jesus was perfect in every way because he's God. So, of course, he was obedient to his Father. But as he went to the cross, he did it with love in his heart for me and for you and for everyone who will call on his name. And I was like, man, the Father that I've always wanted, not only does he love me in spite of what I've done, knowing what I would do, says, yes, I go to the cross with joy in my heart to die for your sin that put me on this cross. Why? Because I love you. That changed everything. And there was lots of tears and snot. And and when I got up off the ground, off my face, I was lighter than I've ever been. And I had a joy that I never had. That girl that I went on that walk with, her name is Hope. And of course, I married her. And we've been married for 8 years this July. And we've got 4 sons. And the day that I was going to take my life, I wrote on a piece of paper that I still have. I wrote, I will never be a father. I wanted to become the thing that I never had. I will never be a husband. I wanted to be to someone what no one was ever to my mom. And I wanted to impact people in a way that both led to positive change, but also compelled them to do something they didn't see possible for themselves. And Ephesians 3:20 is real. I have all those things and I've done all these things, not because of me, but because there's a God that loves me enough to change, transform, and use me for his glory. I think it's important for people to know on that day I gave my life to Jesus, but I was still a very broken man. I still had habits that I should not have. I still had wrong thinking that needed to be corrected. I didn't have competency theologically that I needed to understand, because all the questions that you wrestle with, like who am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to live? All those things, those answers are on the other side of surrender and submission to the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, well said.
It's like anyone's like struggling with their life. I'm like, read Proverbs 3. It's like Proverbs 3 is the answer. It's like you need to surrender everything. And on the other side of surrender is wisdom and understanding and knowledge. I love the title and the concept of this podcast because for me, God didn't throw away everything that I'd done. he redeemed it. What happened is this person that has spent his life crafting his ability to communicate and really using my capabilities regarding creativity and all these things, he shaped them in ways that I now use them for his glory. I've always been someone that's like, man, I wanted to be the best shooter. So I understood to be a good shooter, it's a skill. So to get better at a skill, you need a coach because you need someone to see you in a light that's different in the way that you see yourself. So I have always desired and appreciated constructive criticism because it allows me to become better at what I want to become better at. And in a real way, that's discipleship in a whole. It's like, man, I need to understand God's word and I need someone to both walk with me and hold me accountable to the thing that I'm committed to. So 3 days after I gave my life to Jesus, I walk into a church and I'm like, hey, I've got this crazy story and I would love to sit down with you because I need to understand how to read the Bible. Because for me to tell this story, I need to know the one the story's about because it's not about me. It's about the one who changed my life. That's why I tell people, it's like, man, it's not my story. It's God's story because my story in my hands led to my destruction. God's story in my hands leads to life change, not only in mine and others, because he's the only one that can save anyone. I can't do anything. I can just tell you about the one who can. And I go in this church and I'm like, hey, will someone help me? There was this guy, his name's Andrew Yates, and he had just finished up at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he was now on staff at this church here. And, he didn't have time to spend, 10 hours a week teaching this guy how to read the Bible and how to study the Bible. And he never set out to do that because he, if you ask him, I'm friends with him still. He was like, I didn't have time. So I intended to say, hey, observation, interpretation, application. This is how you read the Bible in context. Start in the book of John, get plugged into a small group. Here's a Bible. Good day, sir. And that's what he said he intended to do. Instead, he felt a very strong conviction from the Holy Spirit. He's like, I need to sit down with this man and pour into him. And he committed to doing that for several years. I fell in love with the Bible. And I was always good at being able to regurgitate, information, just like being a theater guy. And some of the things, it's like I would win like geography Bs and like great at history and stuff like that is because I can read something, regurgitate it, no problem. But really processing it and being able to, interpret it different. Like that was not something that I was good at, but the Bible was different because a very real, alive God was alive inside of me. All of a sudden the Bible became alive and I couldn't get enough of it. I spent all this time with him for several years and then I went to Liberty and got a degree in Christian ministries and God started opening up doors for me to be in vocational ministry and I did that, but all the while I don't want anyone to know anything about me. I just best case scenario, I'm the senior pastor of a church of 50 people tops that's like in the woods somewhere where no one knows who I am. And we absolutely did not live stream. I just want to love on people and teach the Bible. That's all I want to do. 6 years into this process of, me getting theologically competent, I'm sitting in our home in Iowa and I get this phone call from Tucker Carlson and his team. And he's like, hey, we would love for you to come on Fox and share your story. And we want you to do it live from Tucker's studio. So I went out to Portland, Maine, and live on Fox. He asked me, how did you go from being the top porn star in America in 2012 to now teaching the Bible? And the answer was the gospel. And live on Fox for 22 minutes, I walked him through every aspect of the gospel. And we talked about the destructive nature of pornography and some of the other things I'm doing because I've had the opportunity to speak at Capitol Hill multiple times and lobby for legislation and be part of that, just sitting down with state representatives and many things like that. But he was just like, I need to hear the story, but he allowed me to tell that story live on Fox, and Fox didn't. I was shocked, but they let it air. But that interview changed my life, So it's like all of a sudden I was in the dark hiding. Not a ton of people knew my story. And then all of a sudden, I started getting questioned about my story, and I started gaining this large platform. And a lot of the stuff that I do today came from that moment. But I'm so glad that God healed, consecrated, and prepared me. Like we all need that 1 Peter 3:15. We need an answer for the hope that we have. And I love that God loved me. And man, I don't know why I'm getting emotional about that. I love that God loved me enough to protect his son, so that when I got to the point where I could talk about my dad, I was talking about him in a way where I could be honest.
Joshua recently released a book called 7 Lies That Will Ruin Your Life: What My Journey from Porn Star to Preacher Taught Me About the Truth That Sets Us Free. In it, he addresses 7 things that we're told will make us happy and shows how each of them points us back to our need for God. He calls it a recipe for healing based on Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He's also released a podcast called Unmentionable. It's an 8-part documentary that follows his career in the adult film industry and explores the history of pornography in America and the impact on our popular culture. You can learn about all of this on his website, joshuabroome.me. Thanks so much to Joshua for sharing his story. Thanks also for sharing kind reviews on your podcast app or on social media, like this one from Apple Podcasts. I enjoy every story I've ever listened to, and I've heard them all more than once. Sometimes I laugh, sometimes I cry, but I always come away with a blessing to hear over and over again that we serve a great and loving God. Thank you. Hey, if you would like to help this kind of life-changing storytelling grow, you can do that by supporting the Wow God Podcast Network. When you do, you allow us to create podcasts where every story gives listeners a chance to say, "Wow God." You can make a monthly gift of $40 or a gift of any size at wowgod.com. Thanks so much to the Unfolding team, Lindsay Caparoon, Michael Shermack, our producer and network director, Jason Rackow. The Unfolding is a Wow God production, a ministry of the University of Northwestern St. Paul. Discover more at wowgod.com. We'll be back next week with another page of The Unfolding.